Tired of waiting for promises, we did it ourselves. Defense Minister Fedorov stated that Ukraine already has missiles with a range comparable to the German Taurus. After returning from the parade, Lukashenko gathered his generals and spoke about a ground operation. What do the dictator's words mean? That would not be wise. The head of European diplomacy, Kaja Kallas, rejected the candidacy of Russian lobbyist Schröder as a negotiator with the Russian Federation on behalf of the European Union. Moldova has finally joined the camp of Russia's enemies. There, at the legislative level, the use of the Russian language has been restricted. As a failed geostrategist, Putin has gained yet another adversary. We are not only discussing all of this in detail right now, but please don't forget to like this episode. Ukraine and Germany will jointly produce drones with a range of up to 1,500 kilometers. This was announced by German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius during his visit to Ukraine. According to the defense minister, the development of long-range drones is crucial for deterring Russian attacks on Ukraine's military infrastructure. He noted that if used on a large scale, such drones can effectively suppress and destroy enemy air defense systems. Also, the defense ministers of Ukraine and Germany, Fedorov and Pistorius. In Kyiv, they signed a document launching the joint Brave Germany program for the development of defense technologies. Fedorov stated that Ukraine already possesses strike capabilities with a range similar to the German Taurus cruise missiles. But you can never have too many such strike capabilities, Fedorov added. Separately, the minister thanked Berlin for supporting Ukraine's air defense, particularly for funding the systems. Patriot, Aristi, and Rocket systems among them. According to Fedorov, Germany is also funding drone interceptors and related initiatives. Middle strike and deep strike, which Ukraine uses to target Russian military logistics. The parade is over, but fear mixed with shame remains. Retaliatory strikes were promised, but in the end, the destruction of factories was simply swallowed. Ukraine and Russia. They agreed to a temporary ceasefire on Zelensky's terms, but even after it ends, the Kremlin will not have time to protect its strategic facilities. The Ukrainian military has announced a big bang. All the details are in the report.
Ukraine is preparing to strike Russian targets left without air defense by Putin in order to protect the parade. This was stated by the commander of the drone forces, Robert Madar-Brovdi, in a comment to a Guardian journalist.
A symbolic attack on Red Square would make headlines around the world, but he says that Ukraine will likely deliver a slap where Russian air defenses are weaker. Why waste drones on the Great Wall? He said this, referring to the increased security around Moscow. If you strike at the energy sector or the military, the best blow will be on the periphery.
Just a few days before the parade, Ukrainian drones struck precisely and accurately at regions of Russia. This demonstrated just how full of holes the air defense remains in the regions. Putin doesn't care about protecting people or factories. His main goal is to show the world his so-called might through the parade.
Yes, indeed, all this is for the protection of Moscow and the Moscow region, just for the sake of holding the parade. The Putin regime has practically stripped the main European regions, the European part of the Russian Federation, of defenses. It is precisely in these regions, by the way, that the parade has been cancelled. That is, we've heard that in a number of Russian regions, parade marches on May 9th are being cancelled. This is directly related to the fact that the air defense forces concentrated in these regions cannot fully guarantee even minimal protection for holding these parades and other events, since the majority of all air defense resources have been pulled to Moscow. Moreover, it won't be possible to quickly return these systems to their original locations, deploy them in their designated areas, and put them on combat duty.
Furthermore, the Russians are short on air defense not just because of the parade. The Ukrainian campaign to destroy Russian air defense systems and strike deep into its rear has literally created a shortage of traditional defense assets. Let us recall that in April alone, Ukrainian drones destroyed 38 air defense units as well as key radar stations. Ukrainian drones are hitting the Kremlin's image of great power so hard that even Putin himself has started begging for a temporary truce just to be able to hold his victory show on Red Square in peace. Even after the strikes on the air traffic control center in the Rostov area and the resulting transportation collapse at airports in the south of the country, Putin responded like this.
The Kyiv regime has perpetrated and carried out yet another act that is, beyond any shadow of a reasonable doubt, of a viciously terrorist and criminal nature. Namely, the strike directly impacted the critical infrastructure of the Rostov Regional Air Traffic Control Center. This, of course, posed a significant risk that could have seriously compromised the safety of civilian aircraft in the area. Fortunately, no tragic events or loss of life actually occurred during the incident.
But it's nothing serious. The main thing is it wasn't on Red Square. Earlier, the Kremlin threatened to strike Kyiv with Oreshnik if there was an attack on Moscow. But, as Viktor Sobolev, a member of the State Duma Defense Committee, stated, Russia will not bomb Kyiv over the aviation collapse. Russia will only strike if their sacred parade is disrupted. Once again, not because of attacks on factories, key centers, or oil, but only because of strikes on the parade. Yes, because Putin doesn't care about anything else.
For Putin, of course, the top priority is holding the parade, no matter how meager it may be, and no matter how discouraging it may look by 2026, and even if it demonstrates Russia's weakness and frailty. But still, for Putin, the most important thing is holding the parade in Moscow.
Russia is asking for a pause to celebrate victory. But in reality, Russia hasn't even gotten up off its knees yet. Putin made an agreement with Zelensky for a ceasefire from May 9th to 11th just so he could show off on Red Square in peace while telling stories about the great victory.
That our cause is just. Together, victory has always been and will always be ours. Glory to the heroic people, the great victors. Glory to our courageous veterans. Glory to the valiant armed forces of Russia. I offer my heartiest congratulations to you on this great holiday of Victory Day. Hurrah, hurrah, hurrah!
Zelensky allowed the parade in order to create a quiet on the front and to carry out a prisoner exchange. Because people are more important. That's the difference.
This is an absolute disgrace and humiliation for Putin's regime. The entire Russian official crowd, the whole political elite and the propaganda pool were literally beside themselves in hysteria over the threat of a strike on Red Square. And they threatened a nuclear strike and a strike on Kyiv, specifically on the government quarter. They threatened the embassies located in that area, appealed to Trump, asking him to mediate on the issue of holding the parade. In other words, there has never been such hysteria from the Russian side regarding threats to the May 9th parade. There wasn't, and now it depended solely on Zelensky whether this parade would take place or not. Here you could say that the classic phrase, "Thank you, Grandpa, for the victory," can now be interpreted by Russians as "Thank you, Zelensky, for the parade."
But now for the Kremlin, eliminating Zelensky is no longer the only goal. After all, Russia is being shattered and scorched. It is precisely the drones, which most often come from the unmanned systems service led by the aforementioned Mazyar. He himself became a target for Russian special services and a real source of fear for Putin. The devastating strikes by his brigade have become a serious challenge for Russia.
Such decisions are not made by Putin, but by... It is an entirely different and more complex command structure in Russia. That is exactly why Mykhailo himself represents such a formidable and persistent challenge for the Russian occupiers on the ground. It was his specific unit that became one of the most highly effective and formidable on the battlefield. And then they successfully implemented a comprehensive and significant structural reform in the unmanned systems forces. We are seeing the results now, so of course it is quite possible that not only he, but also other outstanding Ukrainian commanders and officers are on the blacklist. But he is definitely among the top names on that list.
Putin agreed to reconciliation, accepted Zelensky's terms, and agreed to talk with the Europeans about ending the war. The parade was not affected, but Russia's economy is dying because of retaliatory Ukrainian attacks on Russian industry. And all Russians have already realized this. Ukrainian sanctions are clearly working better than the European ones.
Putin is terrified of the Ukrainian Magyar, and with good reason. Under the leadership of Robert Brovdi, the UAV forces of the Ukrainian Armed Forces are now terrorizing even the most remote regions of the aggressor country on a daily basis, and these areas have finally experienced what war really means. Meanwhile, Moscow has already come to terms with its status as a frontline city.
Magyar's sanctions have proven to be many times more effective than those of the West. In recent months, there has hardly been a day in Russia without loud fireworks. Ukraine's drone forces have become the occupier's greatest fear, and Robert Magyar Brovdi himself has become Putin's personal enemy. The commander of the UAV forces has become target number 2 for Russia, second only to Zelensky. To be fair, it's well-deserved.
It was precisely this kind of blow that was dealt to Russia in 1917 when the country was fighting in World War I. But victory was stolen from them.
The Russian dictator's fear of Magyar's drones during the parade was so great that he literally had to beg for a truce and even pull almost all available air defense systems to Moscow.
Putin pulled all possible air defense systems to Moscow. In other words, he simply took them away from other critically important sites. Basically, they decided to cover one Botoxed ass at the expense of dozens of oil refineries and military factories.
The result was predictable and explosive.
All of that, it's smoke, just so you know, not clouds. Over there, something blew up. Wings behind the building. Oh, there was another one.
However, it seems the Kremlin still has no intention of returning air defense systems to the regions. The day before, it was reported that there were more than 100 air defense systems around the Russian capital. Their number was only increasing. According to journalists from Radio Liberty, another ring of air defense positions is gradually being constructed around Moscow, primarily consisting of Pantsir missile systems mounted on towers. But then again, who said this will help?
It is absolutely and completely beyond belief that something like this could actually happen right before our very eyes.
As for the ceasefire that the Russian dictator begged for, it's just a respite for the Russian Federation, and Magyar is openly announcing further sanctions deep in the rear.
The celebration of the Free Ukrainian Bird Parade began in advance. The worms, the military-industrial complex, and the energy sector have definitely felt it, and in a fundamentally new rhythm and geography. Siberia may be beyond the mountains, but it's really not that far away. To be continued. 72 hours is not an eternity.
In addition to the announced explosions, Magyar generously warned the occupiers that it is not worth advancing on Kyiv. A new attempt by the Kremlin to seize the Ukrainian capital could turn into the greatest bloodshed in world history.
A blitzkrieg is now impossible. If Russia had 1 million tanks and tried to seize Kyiv again, it would be the biggest bloodbath in world history. 2 million drones would swoop down on those tanks mercilessly and burn them.
Putin's already scarce allies were probably so impressed by his parade that they were genuinely alarmed. They became alarmed and concerned for their own safety. Kim Jong-un demanded that, in the event of his assassination, his loyal subjects retaliate with a nuclear strike. He even wrote this loyalty into his constitution. And as for the potato marshal, as soon as he returned from Moscow, he immediately gathered his generals to plan ground operations. For his own protection. Lukashenko stated that the country's army needs to be modernized with contemporary weaponry, because without it, effective defense is impossible. In general, faith in Putin's nutcracker has somehow...
The overall intensity and presence of the situation have actually diminished quite a bit over the course of time, showing a very subtle but noticeable decrease that has gradually become more apparent as we continue to observe the ongoing developments and changes occurring right now. There's no way around it without a ground operation. And in a ground-based military operation, it is the highly skilled soldiers, our dedicated officers, and the essential weaponry needed for fighting effectively on the ground.
The Russian army is losing steam. On the battlefield, the occupiers are showing even worse results than a year ago. This is the conclusion reached by analysts from the Institute for the Study of War. The details are in our report.
There are more losses but fewer territories captured. The occupiers are failing their spring offensive. In the spring of 26, the Russian army captured almost half as much territory as it did during the same period a year earlier.
In the spring of 2026, Russian troops are showing worse results on the battlefield than in 2025, when the Kremlin was emphasizing its demands for the transfer of Donetsk region.
While in the spring and summer of 2025, Russia was capturing between 300 and 500 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory each month, in the spring of 2026, these figures dropped by more than half to 150 square kilometers per month.
At the moment, thanks to innovative solutions by the Ukrainian General Staff, such as the use of drone wall tactics, ground robotic systems, and remote mining, the front line is practically static. However, it should be noted that Ukraine's defense forces are employing what is known as an active defense approach. This means that whenever possible, they successfully counterattack, as has been demonstrated. Accordingly, this has been demonstrated on the Alexandrovsk, Kupiansk, and also the Lyman directions.
The middle strike drones also play an important role in restraining the occupiers, as the Ukrainian armed forces use them to hunt down enemy air defense systems and logistics deep behind enemy lines. Recently, Azov returned to Mariupol with the help of Hornet drones, which caused panic in the Z community.
The enemy has begun to reach the key logistical artery of the Special Military Operations Zone, the Taganrog-Jankoy roads, which run along the coast of the Sea of Azov through Mariupol, Berdyansk, Melitopol, Henichesk, and into Crimea. In case anyone doesn't know, this is the very road that trucks use to travel to Crimea and the Special Military Operations Zone. Fuel and all military equipment also go along this route. It's 100 to 160 kilometers to the front line. This road is currently being expanded into a highway.
Meanwhile, as the offensive stalls, the occupiers' losses are increasing. Since March, the invaders have been losing more than 1,000 soldiers per day on average. According to SPS Commander Madjar, since December 2025, the Russian Ministry of Defense has not been able to replenish its losses in time.
148,400 people arrived. Russia mobilized and contracted them for the special military operation between December 2025 and April 2026. 156,135 people have left. The enemy's sanitary and irrecoverable losses from drone strikes alone verified in the Delta Situational Awareness System.
To the successes of the unmanned systems forces, we must add the work of Ukrainian artillerymen, as well as losses that have not been verified by photo or video evidence. This includes close quarters combat and occupiers killed under the rubble of buildings and other defensive structures. In total, in April alone, the Russian army lost about 40,000 soldiers.
The tactic of increasing the depth of kill zones makes it possible to hold back further advances by the occupiers, and at the same time multiply the losses of the Russian occupation forces.
While the Kremlin dreams of Ukraine and Donbass surrendering voluntarily, the cost of every meter of captured Ukrainian land on the front line is rising dramatically. Everything is leading to the fact that in the spring of 2026, the Ukrainian armed forces will present the Russians with one of the most expensive bills.
The Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Rustem Umerov, discussed with the United States the formats of meetings and negotiations at the leadership level to end the war in Ukraine. This was reported by the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. He noted that the US and Ukraine continue to stay in contact regarding the issue of prisoner exchanges with Russia. The lists have been handed over, and we expect that the American side will be active in ensuring the implementation of this agreement, the President noted. According to Zelensky, possible formats for meetings and negotiations at the leadership level to end the full-scale war that Russia unleashed against Ukraine were discussed in the United States. Bookmakers have dramatically increased the odds that the fighting in Ukraine will end this year, and Putin has publicly started talking about ending the war. Is the war in Ukraine really coming to an end, or is this just part of the Kremlin's bluff? To lull the anti-Putin coalition into complacency and then strike with renewed force.
Putin doesn't want any more action. As soon as the Ukrainian armed forces started regularly launching more drones and missiles at Russian territory than the Kremlin does at Ukraine, Putin folded. He immediately backed down.
You know, when absolutely everything is perfectly calm, measured, and stable for us, we eventually get incredibly bored and restless. We crave stagnation, some action.
But getting hung up on that alone is counterproductive.
At this moment, Vladimir Putin believes that the ongoing Ukrainian, as he himself put it, conflict is already steadily approaching its final conclusion.
I think things are coming to a close, but still this is a serious matter. We have never been closed off to negotiations. Never.
Moreover, during his speech, the bunker dweller didn't just hint, but openly requested a meeting with Zelensky. And not like before, on the rights of a victor and exclusively in Moscow. Now Putin is ready to go to the ends of the earth as long as Ukrainian drones don't hit his personal bunker.
A formal meeting session can also potentially be convened in a neutral third-party country, but only if conclusive and binding agreements are reached on a peace treaty that should be designed for a long-term historical perspective. In order to participate in this event, or to officially sign a document, but it must be the absolute final concluding point.
For the Kremlin, putting a bold period to the war with Ukraine after the humiliating May 9th on Red Square is becoming an obsession.
Zelensky is teasing Putin and the Russian side is basically swallowing it.
And it will only get worse from here. Well, at least for the Kremlin, that's for sure. Military analysts are in agreement on this. With each passing day, the strikes on Russian territory are becoming more and more destructive. And the much-vaunted Kremlin air defense is holier than a sieve.
This is the reality of 2026. In other words, Russia has fought itself into a situation where Ukraine now has the capability to launch massive strikes. Burning oil refineries are no longer news. People don't even react to them anymore. Remember how it was just a couple of years ago when a strike on any oil refinery would be the main news for the whole day or even several days? Or on some warehouse, for example. Now, a warehouse in Sverdlovsk Oblast was hit and no one even paid any attention to it.
If the ceasefire is not extended, then of course missiles and bombs will start flying immediately. What will we burn this time? That's a big question.
Putin himself understands this perfectly well in the 5th year of the full-scale war.
I cannot see anything unusual around here at all.
But there's simply nothing he can do about it. The military and financial resources of the Russian Federation have been exhausted, as has the patience of the Russian people themselves.
This could ultimately lead to poverty.
Even the most fervent ultra-patriots are beginning to openly criticize the authorities and incite the population to revolt.
This is a catastrophe. We are being killed every day.
And what is the outlook for the Russian army and ordinary Russians? Far gloomier than today's oil rains over Perm and the environmental disaster in Tuapse? At this rate of Ukrainian attacks, analysts say that by summer, most of Russia's territory will look the same.
What will happen in 2027 if the war continues until then? Well, you can imagine that for yourselves. We see the rigidity of the Russian army, we see problems that are growing in Russia, problems with the economy, problems with discontent, problems at the front. And if this war lasts another year, then I think what seems astonishing to us today, namely that it is Volodymyr Zelensky who decides whether there will be a parade on Red Square or not, will seem trivial compared to what will happen in a year. That's when things will really start to get serious.
But Putin still keeps up appearances despite the bad situation. And even though he devoted the lion's share of his latest speech to the issue of a ceasefire, the bunker dweller didn't forget to do something else. He made sure to threaten everyone and everything.
The armed forces, it is absolutely essential that they must concentrate their full attention on the ultimate and complete decisive defeat of the enemy as a critical part of the ongoing special military operation currently taking place.
But those words brought smiles even to the faces of his loyal propagandists. What kind of victory can we even talk about when at this point they'd be lucky just to negotiate a ceasefire with Kiev on any terms?
Ending the war as soon as possible, because the longer he drags it out, the less chance he has of surviving himself. And in good health, at the very least remaining free.
Meanwhile, global bookmakers have started placing their bets on peace in Ukraine. And it must be admitted, they are extremely optimistic. For the first time since the start of the full-scale invasion, online prediction platforms have rated the probability of achieving an end to the war between Russia and Ukraine by December 31st at 100%. The year 2026. By the way, as recently as May 8th. At that time, participants in the betting estimated the probability of such a scenario at about 28%. So, according to bookmakers, the Kremlin and global analysts, the chances of a ceasefire in the very near future are extremely high. However, Ukraine and the armed forces of Ukraine are not letting their guard down.
The head of European diplomacy, Kaja Kallas, rejected the proposal to appoint Gerhard Schröder as a potential EU special envoy for negotiations with Russia. She called the former German chancellor a lobbyist. First of all, if we allow Russia to appoint a negotiator on our behalf, that would not be very wise. And secondly, I think that Gerhard Schröder has been a high-ranking lobbyist for Russian state-owned companies. So it's clear why Putin wants him to be the person sitting on both sides of the negotiating table, said Kaja Kallas. She also reported that during the informal meeting of the European Union foreign ministers, there will be a discussion about possible negotiations between the EU and Russia, as well as the demands that the EU should present to Moscow. The problem of European security lies in the fact that Russia constantly attacks its neighbors. And how can we prevent this? To achieve this, we also need concessions from the Russian side, noted the head of European diplomacy. As an example, she mentioned her visit to Moldova, recalling the presence of Russian troops in Transnistria. This could also be one of the conditions for ensuring stability and security in the region, that they withdraw their troops, stated Kaja Kallas. Meanwhile, Moldova itself is finally moving into the camp of Russia's enemies. There, at the legislative level, the use of the Russian language has been restricted. Transnistria is on the path to liberation from the Kremlin occupiers. In the near future, Moldova may join the European Union. We will tell you in detail how the failed geostrategist Putin has gained yet another adversary. And don't forget to like this episode and subscribe to the YouTube channel Ukraine Today.
Moldova is moving even further away from Russia, now even on the language issue. Recently, the country's parliament restricted the use of the Russian language, which immediately drew a reaction from pro-Russian politicians.
Mr. Radomarian, please take your seat. Please take your seat. Mr. Radomarian, please take your seat. Order, please. Please, Ms. Makary.
The new rules have now set time limits for speeches and declared Romanian as the only working language in parliament. Previously, Russian was classified as the language of interethnic communication, and documents were regularly translated into it. This often became a reason for speculation and disruption of the deputies' work, as happened at the last session.
It is becoming increasingly evident that there truly are such clear indicators, which show that the vast Russian state-controlled information apparatus is now systematically shifting its focus toward more complex social topics.
At the same time, understanding the enormous pressure of Russian propaganda, Moldova is trying, as best it can, to distance itself safely from Russia. By the way, the recent statement about the country's withdrawal from the CIS, this is clear confirmation of that. The Commonwealth itself, created as a union of equals, from the very beginning became an association of almost powerless satellites of Moscow. And it was impossible to endure this endlessly.
For Russia, the CIS was nothing more than a tool to keep the former Soviet republics within its sphere of influence. The agreement with the CIS, as well as trade with Russia, and also the agreement in the field of migration, were nothing more than a club that Russia used against its disobedient former colonies.
The European Union today appears to be the complete opposite. That is exactly where Moldova has set its sights, which the majority of the population voted for in a referendum and re-elected a pro-European president.
We know what disinformation, energy sabotage, economic pressure, and election interference look like. We share this experience with other countries facing similar tactics. That is why Moldova's accession to the European Union will be an act of strategic alignment for the entire Union. After all, we are a stable democracy on the eastern border with direct experience of hybrid warfare, implementing real reforms, and possessing the political will to become a reliable partner.
One of the last arguments of Moscow's supporters is cheap energy resources for its allies. This argument was voiced both when the country left the CIS and with every new anti-Russian decision made by the authorities. However, just like then, now this remains nothing more than Kremlin propaganda.
The energy argument is one of the Russian proxy's favorites. Membership in the CIS gives us access to cheap energy resources, which is actually a lie. And this argument falls apart in 2 seconds. The fact is that throughout its entire membership in the CIS, the Republic of Moldova never gained access to natural resources or natural gas from Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, and Kazakhstan, which are much cheaper than Russian resources.
The language issue is probably the Kremlin's second favorite topic. It was supposedly to protect the Russian-speaking population that they launched the war against Ukraine. Today, these arguments are also being voiced in the Moldovan parliament. For example, a certain Alexander Vershinin from the right-wing party Democracy at Home stated that democracy is deteriorating because of such restrictions.
The disinformation, the operations that